Bonjour. Jean-Paul Restul and Dishnakas, Wajashkina do Dam, Okingidop Minasing, Nadonchiba, Nishnabe and Dao, Waymadagoshi and Dao. Miigwech, Gashemna do, Minukijagak. It's a beautiful day to be joining you on this webinar, this technical issues riddled webinar. We still don't have our guest connected, but we know she's trying. So please bear with us as we some of our house out of the way and we begin our webinar on indigenizing and decolonizing our classrooms. What does it mean? I just want to acknowledge the territory that I'm coming to you from. I'm on Lekwungen territory. The original territories of Songhees and Esquimalt First Nations, whose existence and relationship to this territory continues right to this day. And it's really good to be a visitor on these lands. I've been a visitor here since 2017 when I came out to become chair of the Department of Indigenous Education at the University of Victoria. I introduced myself in Anishinaabe, the Ojibwe language, which is where I'm from. I'm from Anishinaabe-Yaqui, the Ojibwe lands. I'm a member of the Doki's First Nation, which is on the French River in mid-northern Ontario, not too far from Sudbury, the other side of Lake Nipissing from North Bay. And so we have that lovely cruise ship that comes from North Bay, travels into the French River, comes to Doki's First Nation, turns around, goes back. If you ever get a chance to do that, once our distancing restrictions are lifted, that'd be nice to do, but only some time, I think. I am here with our lovely co-organizer and co-host, Angela Nardozzi, who is also trying to work behind the scenes to facilitate our guest joining us as a participant, or as a co-host. So it'll happen, I'm sure, but I want to give Angela a chance to say hello and do a land acknowledgement from where she's from.
Hi, everybody. I am Angela Nardozzi. I'm a guest and settler on Turtle Island. Both of sides of my family come from Italy. And as John Paul mentioned, I am in a different place. I am on the traditional territory of the Wendat, the Seneca, and most recently the Mississaugas of the Credit. And, you know, we're working really hard behind the scenes right now as we speak, edge of our seats to get Dr. Pete on. So I'm going to throw back to Dr. Rasul. Yeah, what are we talking about today and whom are we speaking with once we get them here?
Yeah, exactly. So the topic today with Dr. Shauneen Pete is what does it mean to indigenize and decolonize our classrooms? And Shauneen Pete is someone who I get to work with in the Department of Indigenous Education. She's our Indigenous Resurgence Coordinator, and she has done so many wonderful things in the past as an academic in Saskatchewan. And I don't know, I can't even begin to list all of the many achievements and contributions that Dr. Pete has made. But one of the ones that I think she's very well known for, and many people have seen, is it was circulating quite a lot recently, was the 100 ways to decolonize or 100 ways to indigenize your classroom. And it had so many different suggestions. I think it was built from people asking the questions and Shauneen constantly saying, well, try this, do this. Have you done this yet? Have you read this book? Have you looked at this resource? And putting them all in one place and sending them around. And that's something that's kind of familiar to Angela and myself. We used to do the Gamajitum in, oh, hi, Shauneen. Hi. Just as is the case with some of these webinars, we do tend to have some technical difficulties, and it looks like we've resolved these ones, so it's good to see you here. Just to bring you up to speed, I did a land acknowledgement for the territory I'm on, and Angela did for her. And it's an interesting thing when you do these webinars and you're in different spaces physically, but you're all meeting virtually, that we do those land acknowledgements and we're on different territories So if you wanted to do one for yourself too, when you start, we can do that. I was just taking care of some housekeeping, mentioning some of the things that you're famous for, but I certainly would welcome you adding to that list of many accomplishments. The other thing I just wanted to mention before we get underway too is that these webinars are part of a larger research project on encouraging teachers to take up Indigenous education and perspectives that they do. And so everything we're doing is to try to understand some of the barriers that you face, and also the supports that you receive as teachers. And we want to make those more widely known and available so that teachers can do more of this work. This is a important work. It's a responsibility that you have if you're working in public schools or really any schools in what's currently called Canada. So we want to make sure that we understand better how to support you. And so the work is funded by a Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council grant. And just want to acknowledge their support and thank them for that. And again, this is part of how we're able to do this. And at the end, we do hope that those who are signed up through Zoom can actually take a short survey so that we can continue to catalog and respond to the supports and barriers you're facing. And a lot of us are joining us on Facebook Live, so you might not have access to that survey, but it's still something made possible by Shirk. So just want to acknowledge their support and say, Chi Miigwech, thank you, Haishka. So with that, Shauneen, if you want to introduce yourself and let us know what you've got planned for today, it'd be great.
Thank you, Jean-Paul. Thank you, Angela. Oh, it's really nice to join you all in this conversation today. I am in our intergenerational house with my partner, my daughter and her husband and their baby today. It's a wonderful way to live, it sure is. I recognize that we all come from different kinds of understandings in relation to indigenization and Indigenous resurgence and decolonization and education. And certainly it's an evolving field for all of us. And some of us are elementary and secondary teachers, and others of us are college and university instructors. And some of us are Indigenous and others are settlers. But we're all united in our desire to reform pedagogy and with an aim of reforming society so that it's better for all of us. Like so many of yourselves, I'm a teacher and I really like teaching and I'm really good at teaching. I teach courses in anti-oppressive education, in the history of Indigenous education, Indigenous pedagogy, and Indigenous studies. And I've been doing this work for a very long time. I've been a teacher since, oh goodness, for a very long time, since about 20 years now. I hate to admit it. But I've learned a lot in this work, and I'm really happy with the lessons that I've learned. And I've been, as much as I've been frustrated in the past about the rate of change, it's actually changed a lot, and we've seen great change in the work. When I start my classes and when I start working with students, I always start in the same way. And I ask students to pull out a notebook or pull out their laptops or their cell phones, and I give them 10 minutes to respond to the question. And for me, it's the most important question of all. And I use their responses as a point of reference for all of our other classwork as it starts to unfold for us. So I want to ensure that I'm not just making any assumptions about what they know and what they've learned earlier on in their schooling. And the question, the most important question for me is, how did you learn about Indigenous people in your home, school, and community? That's a big one. Usually students respond with a gasp, oh no, we have to write right now. And they do. And their responses start to flow, and it's really exciting to wonder as they're writing what will come out. And I try to maintain that sense of wonder in that moment with them. I take all of their responses and I collate them and I share with them kind of the collective narrative of who they are as a group. And that story really hasn't changed for 20 years. They're mostly white, middle class, predominantly female students. Many of them declare that they're Christian, and they didn't learn very much. And most of their schooling experiences, very few of them have ever had an Indigenous educator. Usually I'm the first one in their formal schooling. Some of them say that they learned about Batosh, or they learned about Métis people, or they learned about the local Indigenous group, maybe in their community, maybe, but they really didn't learn a lot. And so they're coming to us at university with very, very little understanding about Indigenous experiences, current events, historical factors, and they're really kind of freaked out, especially in teacher ed. So the students that come into the program have often commented, or they tell me, that their Indigenous education has primarily been taken up as in an additive way. And it's often been reduced to the introduction of really limited cultural elements. What do the Indigenous people eat? How did they dress historically? That kind of stuff. And we hear those same kinds of comments that were taken up in Susan Dion's work. And to go a little bit further, the students were also really given some negative ideas about what Indigenous people contributed. And that's hugely problematic for these students. So they're coming in with some deficits, and our responses have evolved over time. And following, so today's presentation is really going to take a look at three key moments, or three key periods of time where educational pedagogy, curriculum, and our ways of thinking about schooling has really shifted. So I'm going to talk a little bit about indigenization, and I'm also going to talk about decolonization, settler decolonization, and a movement towards Indigenous resurgence. So that's where I'm heading to today.
That sounds amazing. I just wanted to remind participants too, if you have questions, so you can put them in the chat, and then when there's an appropriate moment, we can make sure to ask Shauneen, and you can have some of your questions answered.
So you were probably very much impacted also by the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's release of their final report a few years ago. And we saw almost an immediate response in higher education towards the mandating of Indigenous studies courses. So we saw that as a response to the TRC. And while that is a good gesture, and it was an important move in places where Indigenous studies was not taught, it was also a really highly problematic process. So these courses were problematic for a number of different reasons. The onus of responsibility for teaching those courses were often placed on the backs of untenured Indigenous instructors. And as well, the courses were intended to provide kind of a crash course in Indigenous topics for settler students who were predictably resentful for the structure and for the content. And they then directed their hostility towards those untenured Indigenous instructors and towards their Indigenous classmates. And so the environment of the classroom became unsafe for a lot of folks, settler students expressing that the content was uncomfortable for them, that they didn't want to feel guilty, and for Indigenous students and instructors also feeling that resentment and the hostility being directed back to them by settler students. But thinking about that as an initiative, it really intended to try to do some things better. But we have to really think about who the students are here. And again, like I said, I've been teaching education students for 20 years. They're female settler, they're middle class, they're mostly Christian. And they often come into my class and they assume that what they're gonna learn from me is I'm going to provide them with some kind of Indigenous cultural experience. And so I always found that really curious, because I wondered what they would do with it if I offered it to them. And I'll ask them, so what does that mean exactly? And many honestly don't even know how to answer the question. So again, I try to clarify why a focus on culture. And I'm understanding that they've been socialized to two really limiting key ideas. One is the belief in color blindness as a good trait to have. And the second is that their job will be to teach Indigenous children and youth Indigenous culture. And you hear how problematic that can be. So that they're really worried. Their focus is on whether they'll have the knowledge to be able to do that task well. And they're uncomfortable on the one hand because they've been taught not to see color. And on the other hand, they're been taught to assume that their job is to teach Indigenous children their color, that their culture. And they don't know it. So they wonder, how can I teach what I don't know? So indigenization as cultural inclusion is a really limiting pedagogical approach. It's limited in that it makes particular assumptions about the teacher and the learner. And cast in this way, settler teachers remain the knowledge holders, yet they say that they have few authentic experiences with Indigenous people beyond the historical contact that they learned in school and beyond a limiting number of cultural interactions that they may have had in their elementary and secondary school. And some cases, they may know Indigenous people or have relationships with them, but they don't know our culture. And what do they think they are? Why do they think they are in the best position to teach our children our culture? There's such a highly problematic idea. So indigenization as cultural inclusion is problematic when we consider how Indigenous children and youth are cast in this scenario. So Verna St. Denis does such a great job of exposing the deficit theorizing of Indigenous learners and how settler educators place an emphasis on cultural knowledge as opposed to anti-racism in education. And the big problem then is that it becomes that Indigenous children are not culturally connected, not that they are living and learning in a racist structure. And that's where the problem lies. I was really grateful to work for many years in anti-oppressive education, and it allowed us to take up this complicated conversation about our different various identities as settler and Indigenous people, and the kind of aspirations that we have for schooling beyond just the cultural inclusion to something much more complicated. Within the indigenizing curriculum and pedagogical practices, in my own teaching, I privilege the scholarship of Indigenous scholars in the design of my courses. So you're going to see Jean-Paul Ristoul, and you're going to see Verna St. Denis, and you're going to see Dr. Baptiste. And I also tell family stories. I have another kind of story because I grew up middle class to First Nations parents who were part of that first wave of university students, who were activists, who were professionals. My father was one of the first RCMP officers in Canada, and my mom helped to establish the Indian child welfare system on reserve. So I come from parents who were very much engaged in family, in social reform. And my family story is different in a lot of ways because of that middle class and educated family system that I come from. So students find that surprising. They are surprised that it's that there's middle class Indian people. They're surprised that there's generations of Indigenous people in my family who've gone to university. I come from great privilege, and I recognize that I do. My grandmother, my father's mom, started a school in the basement of the Anglican Church at a time where she would have had to ask for permission to leave the reserve under the pass system in order to get a teaching certificate. When I can share these authentic stories with our students, it helps fill in some of the gaps and helps them understand that the legacy of colonization still impacts us today, and it's still very much present in the Indigenous story. To the claim by many educators that they can't find teaching resources. And so my students are able to demonstrate, even in first year courses, that there's an abundance of resources out there, and it's really not all that hard to find them. So students experience I show the videos of Indigenous schools and classrooms and instructional practices to show them that in a lot of ways, good teaching practice is good teaching practice. And what's working effectively in schools in Indigenous communities are the same kinds of things that are working really well in other schools. So there's not a grand mystery here, that it's actually very approachable and very adoptable kinds of pedagogical practices that they too can be taking up. I have students read stories of white and BIPOC teachers in Indigenous communities, so they get a sense of what that work looks like for non-Indigenous people. And I require students to learn how to ask. And by that, I mean, I want them to learn the cultural protocol norms in the local community and with various individuals. So in my courses, I've had students identify an Indigenous person that they'd like to work with. I ask them to find out what that person's cultural protocol norm is, and then to practice that protocol norm with that person, and then to engage with that Indigenous educator or elder or community member or what have you. And I'll target the conversation, sometimes to resiliency and sometimes to school experiences. We debrief our learning in circle. And part of why I do that is because my students, when they come into the classroom, they often claim that they don't have a story, that I have a story, right? About my grandmother, about my parents, but they don't have a story. And so I remind them that their story begins in this time when they had to do this assignment for Dr. Pete's class, and they had to go and practice cultural protocol. So that becomes their story that they can relay, that can create changes for other educators. Because my intention in my work with indigenizing curriculum and pedagogy is ultimately that I want all teachers to be more effective in their relationships with Indigenous people. I don't want them to just teach content. I want them to engage relationally. So as students learn from these various different curriculum approaches, of course, we have to take up discussions of racism and social inequality experienced by Indigenous people. And many learners who are coming to learn these things often for the first time perform demonstrations of white fragility. And more recently, I would refer to it as settler fragility. Those performances of anger, guilt, and shame and violent rejection have to be anticipated in these curriculum spaces, and we have to be able to respond to it effectively. So I actually have students, once they start expressing, these emotions to the content that we're learning, I actually have them read D'Angelo's work. So it helps them to understand that it's not just them. It's not an individualized experience. It's actually a bit of a collective white or collective settler experience that they're having that's well documented and it's predictable. And so that it's not something that I wouldn't not anticipate. So in terms of indigenization, these are some of the ways that I take up that work. And of course, we see it happening in lots of other ways as well. I'm just going to take a pause here because we do have a question in the chat.
And they do seem to be related too. So yeah, the question about in response to settlers who are defensive or uncomfortable, is it appropriate to tell settler students and people that they're not responsible for what has happened in the past, but they are responsible for improving attitudes and achieving reconciliation now? I think you probably have a response in mind to that question. And someone also had responded to that to say, I think everyone is responsible for their attitudes and the onus shouldn't just be put on settlers to improve attitudes to achieve reconciliation. So the fact that it's a kind of a two-way street, but I'd like to hear Dr. Pete's ideas about this.
I think, when we first start taking up some of those difficult conversations, students are really reluctant generally to talk about them. It can be a very personal experience for Indigenous students sitting in those settings, and they can't separate themselves out necessarily from the content, the issues, and how their family is experiencing it, right? And so we have to be really mindful of the trigger points for a lot of students and the various ways in which they're going to be responding to content and pedagogy here. and find new ways. We really have to build our skill set in conflict resolution, in trauma reduction, and helping to heal trauma in the moments that they're emergent in the classroom, and to be really present and adaptive to what our students are needing right there in that moment. So lots and lots of tools in the toolbox for teachers to help get through all of this. So I wanted to start with this foundation of indigenization because its learning outcomes are quite different from the decolonial learning outcomes. And if you'll bear with me, I'll talk a little bit about what some of that looks like. So in terms of decolonizing that shift, so I've been teaching in primarily anti-oppressive education courses in Saskatchewan, and over time, I came to recognize, of course, because I'm like a lot of other instructors in universities, I didn't get this stuff either. It wasn't in my teacher ed program. It wasn't really a topic of discussion in my graduate studies. And I studied education administration. We were just barely talking about feminism in relation to leadership at that stage. So, you know, the decolonial discussion, completely absent. So I just want folks to understand that this wasn't just because I was always, you know, really brilliant at it. It's been a work in the progress, and I've had lots of time to kind of sort it out. So there was a stage in my teaching work where I began to question the focus primarily on racism, because I also understood and was emerging in my understanding that we are all also shaped by a particular kind of settler colonialism. And especially in the prairies, we could just see it performed in so many really negative ways. So my work and my emergent understanding led me to a pathway towards a deeper understanding of settler colonialism and its effect on developing teacher identities. And so my work shifted from racism and anti-racism to settler decolonization. So these shifts in focus to understanding colonization and ongoing settler colonialism also resulted in changes to my teaching work. I really placed an emphasis on exposing the truth of colonization and what that means. It's the elimination and violent displacement of Indigenous people from their traditional territories. And Patrick Wolf reminds us that it was an invasion as a structure, not as an event. That allowed the settlers to stay. And that structure for us can be understood in the kinds of policies of disadvantage that were created, the reserve system, the Indian Act, and all of its associated effects have to be also understood in this process. And students would often respond, okay, I'm hearing what you're saying, but that all happened a long time ago. And I didn't do anything to Indigenous people, and my family never did. But if we're thinking about colonization and settler colonialism, and because it's a structure that's ongoing, that maintains inequalities and just disproportionate access to power in a lot of ways. So an incredible book I found, and a big shout out to Emma Battell-Lowman and Adam Barker, who wrote Settler. This book really changed my life, and I was really introduced to it just over a year and a half ago. And they are graduates from the University of Victoria, and they introduce settler as a concept that work and a language of settler that really looks like the relationships with Indigenous people and responsibilities of settlers if we're really serious about reconciliation. So their work really helped my thinking. And so my teaching work started to include decolonizing consideration, which anticipated anti-racism, certainly, but also took up anti-capitalist pedagogy. I'm influenced here by Tuck and Yang as well, who remind us that decolonization is not a metaphor, nor is it interchangeable with other things that we want to do, like social justice, and that it has a very different outcome as well. So in terms of decolonizing curriculum, in my coursework, I begin with defining settler colonialism and settler identity. We talk about settler privilege and settler fragility. And of course, we have to talk about land, because colonization was a process of the violent displacement of Indigenous people from land. And that's the beginning of that story. And it goes on to be maintained in lots of different ways. One activity that I do with students is I have them write a decolonial story of place. So I say to them, I want you to go to a park, a monument, identify a building, a street, a neighborhood, a waterway, a beach, what have you, and investigate the dominant story or the settler story of that place. And then once you've completed that, I want you to go back and do research on the Indigenous story of that place. Here in Victoria, when I first moved here, the McDonald statue was being removed. And so that was big in the news. And so for some students, they took a look at that colonial story of McDonald, and they flipped it around and looked at the impact of McDonald on Indigenous people in this territory. And for them, that was like an aha moment. Oh my goodness, what other stories have been erased here? When we do a land acknowledgement, are we going beyond the land and also digging into the histories of this place and the silences around place here? So this type of inquiry requires students to really dig deep into themselves, into land, ideas of nationhood and privilege and power. It results in really big feelings, right? In response to seeing self in relation to settler colonialism, suddenly they're implicated. And there's a real strong tendency for them towards resistance and rejection of this content, and this real desire for settler innocence, as Paulette Reagan says. So for me, the aim is to build learner stamina for the ambiguity that's needed as we explore more difficult topics. And so I'm just going to say that again. My aim is to build learner stamina for the ambiguity. And some of those emergent topics that we take up are things like the inquiry into missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls, the conflicts associated with national resource development priorities, national funding inequality in a COVID pandemic, for example, those issues emerging today. And how I help students to gain that stamina is by having them position themselves in relation to colonialism and then in relation to decolonization. I really appreciate Sheila McLean, a professor from the University of Saskatchewan, and an activity that she does that has to do with settler colonial stories and family stories in particular. So students in her courses have to interview family members about when they arrived into this territory. What was the mechanisms that helped to support their settling in the particular landscape? Who was displaced from this work? From this settlement process? What facilitated that settlement? This exercise is really important in helping students to expose the privilege of land ownership and the legacy of the meritocracy myth, the enduring ideas of prosperity and property and family narratives that maintain these ideas. This approach allows us to better understand the persistence of land conflicts. You don't have to go very far to search for them either. Gerald Stanley is one of the, I think, more recent painful reminders of the conflicts that exist. I want students to begin to practice becoming what Veracini calls a worse settler, someone who is actively working against settler tendencies towards innocence and distancing from responsibility. So one of the activities I did in the classes, I had students engage in a brainstorming activity for a plan for settler reformation movement. So the big question was, what's your slogan? Who are the organizers? Where are you meeting? What's your soundtrack? What's your logo? Who's your intended audience? You know, how are you taking up this reformation movement? What does that look like? And students were kind of aghast, I think, when we first threw it out there, but they got it. They understood that settler decolonization actually requires activism. that it requires a foundational base of understanding of common ideas, and it requires action. It requires engagement. And so students are still reflecting back on that idea that we had a year and a half ago, and they're quite loving it. It's leading them, some of them, into some new areas of inquiry. Because those are problematic conversations to be having in classrooms and in spaces. Many of the students require some time to process it. So I facilitate talking circles in the classroom to normalize settler fragility, but I'm not so emphasizing the fragility part of it. What I'm looking at is how to collectively identify strategies that build stamina, resourcefulness, and combat resistance within themselves as settler groups. And I want them to have the space to be able to do that. So we create the space for individual reflection and group debriefs towards healing and transformation. I structure coursework in such a way that it's experiential. I offer students opportunities to use arts-based and story to vision and collaborate together. And we set accountabilities. So what will you do with what you learned becomes one of the final questions I ask in courses. Because my intention is to really help them reframe themselves. I really do want them to become worse settlers in order to move more confidently in their relationships with Indigenous peoples. So I'm just going to take a pause there for a second, because that's heavy stuff.
It is.
Where else are we taking up this conversation?
Yeah, and I had so many questions, but the one that I'm thinking about right now had to do with something you were saying earlier with the activity or assignment that they have to tell a decolonial story about a place. And I was thinking about how it's so easy to find the settler version of a place. So like I can go and see the little plaque that's there and say, on this date, so and so built a farm here or something. And but how do they locate the Indigenous stories? I'm curious how some of the students have located the Indigenous stories. I mean, sometimes we have the connection to people who can share that history. Like if we were to meet in this area, say Cheryl Bryce has got a lot of good stories, but can they access her? Can they find her? I think there's a reason we can't find these stories. So I'm curious how you connect them to these things.
I think what's wonderful with creating those activities for students is that they are resourceful. They learn to be really resourceful. They learn to take some chances. So some of them put on their investigator hats, and they Google the local First Nations community. They see what's presented on their website. They might make a phone call to the band office. Like they're doing all kinds of different things to try and access additional information. Some of them have had to, out of necessity, ask some of their classmates who redirected them in some new ways. Some of the students in particular with that activity made their way to First People's House. They knocked on the door of the elders, they sat down with them, they started that relationship. And so it became a real relational extension for them. And those relationships carried on after the assignment was over. In another case, two of the students were at one of the local beaches, and there was an older First Nations man there with his grandchild, it looked like. So they, had to have the little side talk. Should we go ask him? What do you think? I don't know. Well, maybe we should. I think that's the thing to do. And so it was really for them kind of building their capacity to engage with Indigenous people. And what they found was a welcoming response and a detailed story. And they asked if they could quote the person, and he was very honored, and they exchanged, names. And it was, the learning outcomes exceeded expectation.
Oh yeah, it sounds like. And I could imagine like they probably got lucky with whoever they saw on the beach that day, because I can imagine a lot of First Nations people they don't know that history themselves, and they are trying to find their way to it. So I'm kind of curious about that too. If you have Indigenous students who are thinking, well, I don't know the story of this place either, or that mountain, or this beach, and do they carry a lot of shame or guilt about that themselves?
Some of them do, and they did express that, and they, ended up having a different kind of conversation with their family members. For one, it helped, for one student, it really helped her to reconnect with an auntie who was the knowledge keeper in her family. And then her auntie was saying to her, like, you need to come out, and she got her reconnected into community and to other activities. So her, that again, it's the magic of the relationality, right? That really goes beyond anything that we're really facilitating. And that's what's really exciting. So yeah, folks find their way back in.
Yeah, and I think
I
it's
had
useful to, oh, sorry, go ahead.
I was just going to say that when I had the witness blanket at the University of Regina, I hosted it there, and there was a student who volunteered because he wanted to know more about residential school, and he came and he joined us to be a facilitator for school group, and he was from my mom's reserve, and so then I'm like, no way, you're from Cowses, oh that's so cool, who's your people? And then he goes, well, that's the part I don't really know. He talked about being scooped, and he was on a pathway to reconnect. And well, long story short, he makes connections with young people and with teachers, and then soon he's meeting family members, and it just kind of goes from there. And there's something really wonderful and magical about that too. Yeah.
Absolutely. And I think that ties into the thing I was going to ask earlier was how you mentioned it's a structure, not an event. And
Yeah.
and I think that's very useful when you have that kind of situation where an Indigenous student or family doesn't necessarily have the connection to the knowledge or the history, and
Mm-hmm.
that it's not necessarily their fault, right? Like it's part of that structure that took language and culture from our people historically and made it so that we didn't know where to go to find those things, or we didn't have those things in our family. I remember going to a language conference, and it was perhaps day 3 of this 4-day conference, and Maria Campbell was the keynote. And she said, I've been hearing a lot over the last couple days, people apologizing for not knowing their ancestral language or heritage language. And she goes, I don't want you to apologize for not knowing it, but apologize for not doing something to connect with it now. And so she was
Exactly.
focused on the now and saying, there's a reason historically that you have had this taken from you. And so it's good to know that structure that led to that,
Right.
but also then say, well, so what am I going to do about it? So that Reformation movement for settlers, I think that's really good to ask everyone, like, what is your plan now that you know this? What are you going to do? And I feel like Thomas King ended his Truth About Stories lectures that way as well. Like, this now. So now you have no
Right.
excuse, right?
Exactly. I think it's one of the pieces I really quite love is that, in thinking about the possibilities for reconciliation, whatever that means, and all of these discussions, that have kind of become much more front and center, and especially in the academy, is the discussion of our work and their work, settler work and Indigenous peoples' work. And in my mind, I've been thinking a lot about how Indigenous people have this firsthand experience with oppression, with systems of domination. We've been very actively resistant to them. And on the other hand, settlers kind of had the let's do beadwork and make some bannock and learn about Louis Riel, and that's kind of the extent of it, but they don't know what their role is in relation to reconciliation. And this gives them a real clear pathway of not only content knowledge but experiential learning and responsibilities towards reformation in a real way. And so as an educator myself, it's never just about content. It can't ever be. It's always got to be with reframing and trying to reform society for the betterment of all of us. And so that part for me is really exciting. And I want to chat with a little bit just about the Indigenous resurgence piece, because I think working in our department in Indigenous education, we get to do that every day, and it's such a blessing. After 20 years of settler decolonization and anti-oppression, I could tell you it's about time I got me some resurgence. So I'm really happy about that piece. And this work works a little bit different. It really focuses in on the Indigenous learner. It's on families and communities. And in our work, in our department, it's really about language reclamation and towards revitalization. I'm really proud of my colleagues' work because they've situated their course delivery in communities, in Indigenous communities. And so our Indigenous language revitalization courses are offered in community and in the territories of Indigenous people. We engage local people as primary educators, and oftentimes these classrooms are intergenerational, and they are framed in such a way that they begin with land and they reflect the seasonality of that particular place. And it shifts the focus also to land as teacher. So when we're walking on land, close to water, in nature, we listen deeper, differently. We practice deep listening practices. We listen not only with our minds and with our bodies, but also with our spirit. And we allow and create space for that to shift something in us, to engage with the sacred in a new way that often is limited in more Western types of classrooms. The focus in Indigenous resurgence work is always on relationships as well. And it's a focus on Indigenous futures. And what does this community aspire to? What we've heard in the communities that we've worked with is that they wanted to have not just the certificate and the diplomas, but there was a really strong desire for a Bachelor of Ed in Indigenous language revitalization, which then has led to the graduate programs, both the master's and the special case PhDs. And so with this Indigenous futurity in mind, we are really addressing local need. And we're doing that work in some interesting ways through curriculum and pedagogy. There's a primacy of Indigenous intellectuals, the elders, and scholarship too. We practice self-location and use that as a point of reflection. I shared earlier that I come from a middle-class family. I'm a Cree woman, and I recognize my class privilege. And I use it as a critical point of discussion oftentimes in the work that I do. Our pedagogical practices include storytelling and humor. They're arts-based and experiential learning together. We make things together. Wonderful activities in our coursework that we're planning for the summer and in the summers past have included things like making a welcome poll together, or creating a large piece of artwork together. And kitchen table learning happens where we're teaching one another what we know. It's a collaborative learning experiences of making drums together. And oftentimes our coursework is through intensives, intensive learning experiences that are day-long or week-long over the course of 2 or 3 weeks. In other locations, we learn through ceremony. My good friend, Dr. Sasakamoose, and her students built a lodge with the guidance of local elders, and then they participated in sweat together as a form of learning how to be more effective in the counseling field. In other settings, students are learning through harvesting together. So they're gathering sweetgrass or they're gathering sage and what have you, and learning the protocols around that. And I love the story of Dr. Alex Wilson and her students going on a canoe trip in Manitoba. It's learning through those land-based ways too that are really effective at building those relationships, not just with the human, but the other than human as well. We purposefully weave through these learning materials through several classes to build towards mastery. So students, for example, in Jeff Corntassel's class, were referencing their readings from my course and back and forth like that to really strengthen and deepen their understanding of these concepts that cut across one field to another. And we also give back within these structures. So part of Indigenous resurgence is the full circle of learning, acquiring knowledge and the practice and the giving back of that knowledge. So Jeff Corntassel and his students are clearing invasive plants, for example. And Jolie Sasakamoose is growing a medicine garden, and they're harvesting medicines to share with others. And more recently, they've been preparing meals for elders and vulnerable people during this pandemic. These demonstrations of processes of learning allow students then to use a variety of other strategies, often artistic, using photo voice or art journals or artistic productions to demonstrate what they know in a more holistic way and not in the linear fashion of writing a paper. And we're also calling for changes in how we assess. So movement towards pass-fail classes, self-analysis, and focus on the process, not just on the content. So there's a lot of hope and possibilities for these pedagogical reforms that I think can be really effective for both K to 12, but also higher education too. And I call on you to, as excited reform or forward-thinking educators, to take up some of the practices guided by the local Indigenous people that you work with and allow that relationship to guide you down the path together.
Yeah, call to action. I noticed there was a question in our chat about self-location. Someone was saying, well, basically, could you talk a little bit about what you mean by self-location and how can, I'd say, as teachers do that work?
I think there's a couple things. And first off, I want to talk about myself as a teacher in relation to self-location. So I share with my students that my parents both went to residential school, that I'm the first generation not to have to go. And so there's privilege in that. And there's losses. So I don't speak my language, though I'm learning. I really appreciate Chris Simon Says on Facebook. It's like my best teacher right now. So big thanks to Simon Bird for allowing me a place to learn. And there's humility in those declarations. And I think as teachers, we oftentimes struggle with our own intellectual humility. So back to self-location. It's about really being real about who am I? Who am I related to? Who's claiming me as a part of their community? It's also about recognizing the ways that I've been shaped. I've been shaped by two middle-class, urban, well-educated parents. And that positions me in a very different way, perhaps than some of my relatives. In the practice with settlers, I think it's also about recognizing their own positionality in relation to settlement and getting clear on their own stories and recognizing that those experiences shape who they are and how they see the world. And that it's not, it doesn't have to be a moment of apology, right? It's just, this is who I am.
Yeah, it's a very truthful kind of, coming to understanding how you know what you know, I think, by understanding what sort of subjectivities and identities shape your way of looking at the world. So that's, I think, what we try to do with self-location. I know that there's a couple more questions kind of focused on advice for newcomers. So you had been talking about how the majority of our teacher education candidates they tend to be white women, sometimes often Christian, and often with a longer history in Canada, but we do have a different approach as well to addressing newcomer identities, and I wondered if you could address that.
Both here at the University of Victoria and at the University of Regina, I spent some time working with folks who deliver orientation, and orientation specifically to international students and visiting students. So in that case, we give them the bit of the background around the history of colonization in Canada and help them to recognize the parallels perhaps in their own home communities of origin, and to see what the language is there for the Indigenous people, what their lived experience is like, so that they can recognize those circumstances here in Canada. So then it's not such a big surprise. I'm really challenging folks in international programming to be proactive in speaking to our colonial history and to outlining it, because otherwise, in my questioning of international students, I would ask them, when's the first time you heard something negative about Indigenous people? And sometimes they would say, in the cab on the way from the airport to the university. So that socialization process to the dominant ideas that are held in Canada happens really, really quickly. And we have, as a responsible educator, I think we have to get in front of that, and we have to present the story that we want to tell. For newcomers, there's so many learning opportunities. There really, really is. There's so many things to read. There's so many videos available on the National Film Board website. They don't even cost anything. Netflix has lots of resources. There's just a ton of videos and accessible resources. Once you start digging into them, they start to appear more frequently, and it's a really exciting time to learn. And then do the self-care that's needed, because the stories aren't pleasant. They're difficult. They're difficult knowledges. Yeah.
It's hard to binge watch residential school documentaries.
Yeah, it's so true. Yeah.
I'm conscious of the fact we're already at 5, and I'm thinking we probably need a part 2 and a 3 and a 4. It should just be a series.
I was going to say the same. But I'm curious. Yeah, like what's the feeling? Should we keep moving, or should we bring it to an elegant close?
I wonder about that too, because there are a couple questions that have come up, but I guess one thing we should tell everyone so that they know is that when these videos get archived, we do try to include also a list of the resources that were mentioned in a way so that you can find titles, you can find authors, which you heard Shauneen talking about, but perhaps you didn't know how to spell their names and that sort of thing. So we'll try and make sure that gets done. And then there were a couple questions. I don't know if you want to stay a couple minutes later to answer them, or.
Yeah, for sure.
Okay, that's very generous of you. Thank you. What should we start with? I guess there's a question about self-location for young people. So like, say you're in a grade 3 classroom, can you start a discussion with 8-year-olds about how to self-locate, and can it go deeper than just my religion and where I'm from? And then another thing was more books to recommend.
Oh, I have a reading list. But in terms of self-location, I think, yeah, absolutely, getting started early and helping children to understand that their positionality is also informing their experiences. You know, I remember having an interaction with a young person. He was 7, and he was playing, and he said to his mom while he was playing, his name was Ben, and Ben's now a big guy, but when he said, "Mom, if colonization and decolonization is about land, and decolonization really means giving land back to Indigenous people, where do Indigenous people want us to go?" And he was 7, right? So, I mean, when we welcome in these conversations and we create space for them, kids will ask the questions, and we should walk down that road with them in an honest way. Yeah.
Yeah, that's heavy, man.
Yeah, right. And it was awesome because like Ben knew enough to ask his mom, maybe I should ask Shauneen that question. Mom, do you think it's a tobacco question? And so I got a phone call from little Ben, and Ben said, I think this might be a tobacco question. I said, you know what, Ben, it's just a coffee and tea, like questions will come on over. So Ben he brought his mom, and he came over and was very serious. And he sat at my table, and he asked me the question, and we talked about it. And I said to him, Ben, I've come to love you. And I have a really important relationship with you and your family, and I don't want you to go anywhere. But we do have to talk about what land back would look like. And maybe we don't have to have that conversation right now, but at some point we will need to have it. Yeah.
Wow.
And he said, okay, thanks.
Yeah, open and honest discussion, unlike some that you can have with much older folks.
Yeah, it's true.
And rooted in love. I love that. Rooted in, like, just like care and love. Thank you for sharing that.
Yeah, that's really moving. We probably should end with that, but I just wanted to say, in relation to what books you would recommend, there's a number of titles in one of Shauneen's famous pieces, which is 100 Ways. What is it? 100 things you can do to
100 ways to indigenize and decolonize your teaching. And I wrote it, I thought about it while I was mowing my lawn. And because people like, where do I start? How do I start this work? What should I do? And I'm like mowing my lawn, and I'm like, well, you could start with this, and you could do that, and there's also this, and and there were 100. It's a start.
and there's a number of books and readings in there to start with too. So if you can find that one, because it's easy to find online, I find. It points you to all these other things. And there was another resource that Angela and I had worked on before, and it started with people asking at the end of classes, if there's one book I should read, what should it be? And it would start with, maybe Olive Dickinson's Canada's First Nations, which is already a problematic title, but that's a whole other story. And then Truth About Stories from Thomas King. And I used to recommend all kinds of titles, and Angela did too. And then we started putting this list together that we would just hand out, and it got bigger and bigger, and people would recommend things to us. And so Deepening Knowledge, the portal to all of these different resources, was born at the University of Toronto. And so, like, there's so much out there, and I guess it can be a bit overwhelming sometimes for people to see how much there is and think of where to begin. Right. But I think your list is a good one. I think your list is where people should start.
Excellent.
Yeah.
Arthur Manuel's my favorite. Settler, love Settler. I recommend it to everybody.
I did put that in the chat too, so people can look up Emma and Adam's work.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yes, and as John Paul, as you mentioned, I will ensure that all of the amazing resources that you mentioned, Dr. Pete, will go along with this video when we post it. So I guess as we begin to come to a close, I just want to thank to you, Dr. Pete, for, first of all, thank you for your patience as we got started today. Oh my goodness. And it all worked out beautifully. And I just want to say, I was doing some behind the scenes technical stuff because that wasn't the end of our technical issues tonight. But it was such an honor to listen to you. I've never heard you speak before, and I was just speechless, which is new for me. But taken aback by your brilliance and your humor, and right at the end there and throughout, but right at the end there especially, the way you approach this was in such a heartfelt way. So thank you so much for joining us today.
You're welcome. So glad to be invited. Thank you for the honor of joining you. Thanks.
Yeah, it really was quite an honor to have you here, and I'm so grateful for all the wisdom that you shared. I know there's so much more that we could do, so maybe we will have a part 2 at some point. I don't mean to put you on the spot right now. We'll talk about it and think about it, but I just want to say my heartfelt thanks as well, Chi Miigwech and Haishka Siam, and I hope you have a wonderful evening. Hope all of our chat participants and everyone who signed on has a good time this evening as they leave and go to their own places. And also want to ask you to take some time to do the survey as you close as well, because that helps us to help you as teachers. And thanks. Angela will be in touch with information about where to find the archive and additional resources. So cheers. Thank you.
Take care. Bye-bye.
Bye, everyone.